daughter. I don't know why I feel obligated to say that, but before this audience, but I proudly do say that to all of you. And I actually thought of my father as I was producing this talk to all of you. So part of my work, a very important part, is to spread the word in the community about this incredible gem for the Jewish people. This is an untapped resource in America, and I am passionately committed to bringing the National Library of Israel into the Jewish lives of people in America. So I'm welcoming all of you to join me in that journey. And I hope that today, as I share a brief introduction about the library, and more importantly, as Yoel shares the nuggets and the depth and the expanse of what the library has to offer with you, that you will join me in sharing information with your congregants, your students, your colleagues about this resource in our midst. Of course, we are the people of the book, and the library really is a manifestation of the essence of who we are. So just to give you a very brief sense, and I'm going to talk very quickly because there's so much information that I just want to pass through you, and then you can dig deeper later on. But to give you a sense of the origins of the library and a feel for it, it began in 1892 and was established by B'nai B'rith as the Midrash Abarbanel, and it was Israel's first permanent public library in then Palestine. So just to orient you, this was 5 years before Herzl convened the Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And you're really going to see how much of the history of the development of the library is aligned with really the growth of the state of Israel. The library's collections grew and was part of the pioneering spirit afoot in the land. And many volumes were gathered here. They related, of course, to our Jewish text, but also to other topics: mathematics, science, secular philosophy, modern educational methods, and such. And the library's reading rooms and meeting rooms really were cultural and educational centers, or a cultural and educational center for the city's residents at the time. Herzl himself recognized the significance of the library and personally helped build the library's holdings. By 1903, just to give you a sense of the volume, the library's collections were at 22,000. Here you see an image of the library building itself. And there the library grew, and eventually the library's collections became a part of Hebrew University when the university was founded in Mount Scopus in the right around 1925. And you could see here what I love about this quote from Chaim Weizmann at the founding of the library, if you all can see it here, is that to me, Weizmann is really pointing out that even as the country is building its roads and its bridges, the essence of the library of the state of Israel is its intellectual growth. So to me, it reminded me of the infrastructure plan that's such a controversy right now, and thinking about, infrastructure means roads and bridges. And here Weizmann saying infrastructure is also libraries and our minds and our spiritual life. So here, again, the library grew on the Mount Scopus campus until the War of Independence. And in 1948, here you see armored vehicles taking the books from the Mount Scopus campus when access to the university on Mount Scopus was blocked, and the books were moved and eventually came to the Givat Ram campus. Here you see some students helping in that effort of transferring to Givat Ram. And there the library grew and was housed at Hebrew University, which I'm sure all of you have been to and have used the reading room where the library flourished and continues to flourish to this day. In 2007, the government of Israel officially established a charter establishing the National Library of Israel. And what really made this unique is that the library is the library of the land of Israel, the state of Israel, and the Jewish people worldwide. And it is with that spirit of that third tranche of the library's mission or charter that really enables and emboldens NLI USA here to say, hey, this is our library, not, for the Jewish people worldwide, and more people need to know about it. So what is happening with the library now? This image right here you see is what the library will look like in just about a year from now, in the summer of 2022. This building will be opening, and it is going to be an incredible destination. I want to give you a feel for the scope of the holdings of the library. It is, of course, a place of books. But it is also a place holding, 60 million pages of archives of the Jewish people, 8,000 ancient maps, 2 million photographs, 2 million plus digitized pages from the historic Jewish press, 171,000 pages of Ottoman and Palestinian newspapers, hours and hours of music that's available to everybody. 1,000 personal archives. It really is expansive in its scope. There are 4 main collections of the library that I just want to, give you a quick overview of. Of course, our heart and soul is our Judaica collection, and we're privileged to have Yoel, who will be diving into an aspect, a crucial aspect of our collections. The highlights of the Judaica collection include so many things, but just to give you, just a little taste, we have the personal archives of Martin Buber. We have holdings from an Afghan Geniza dating back to the 11th century that shows Jewish life in Afghanistan with 250 pages in Hebrew and Aramaic and Persian. We most recently received a Megillat Esther, a 15th century Megillat Esther from Spain, Portugal, pre-expulsion period. We have the handwritten papers of Maimonides, and here you can see in Judeo-Arabic, his writings where you see he's erased, and if you look closely, and amended and corrected his own writings. We have papers, collections from Rabbi Yosef Caro's signature in a collection of pages from the Responsa. And this is one of 3, you can see with the arrow here, one of 3 original signatures that we have in our collection at the library. Of course, in our historical Jewish press, we have RCA material, and we have here copies from our papers of the RCA calling for support of the Zionist movement. Here we have an excerpt from the Yiddish press. And in total, here you just see a scattering of the over 1,154 press clippings mentioning the RCA in our archives. In addition to the Islam and Middle East, the Judaica collection, we have our Islam and Middle East collection, which is really the leading collection of its kind in Israel, and is one of the foremost Middle East research collections in the region. We have hundreds of books, including rare and early prints. We have approximately 2,500 Arabic, Persian, and Turkish manuscripts, major scholarly journals, a wide selection of 20th century Palestinian newspapers, contemporary journals, and such. In addition, we have a humanities collection as our 3rd collection, which really again gives context for the intellectual offerings and collections of the library. And some, one of our, gems that we have is Isaac Newton's handwritten papers. We have 7,000 pages of his papers representing theology related to the Bible and science. We have one of the largest collections of maps of the region, which are just incredible. And of course, one of our gems is our Max Brod papers, the personal papers of Max Brod, which include one of the most significant and expansive collections of letters and manuscripts written by Franz Kafka, his dear friend. The National Library of Israel is the place of the collective memory of the Jewish people, but of course of Israel. And with that, we have the history of Israel reflected in many different ways. We have posters and photographs and musical archives and personal archives from authors and Natan Sharansky. We have our most recent archives that came to us are the Chana Senesh papers, which include her original writings, her poetry, handwritten here. You see Eli Eli, we have her immigration papers, we have her typewriter, her journal, all kinds of incredible artifacts. So the library is really meant to be not just a place to collect and preserve our ancient texts, but a place where everything can come alive. And the library is really moving in its renewal stage from a place of collection to an even more of a place of a cultural center, a place for film, a place for music, a place for having intellectual international conferences, a place for children to gather, to engage with our, at least copies of our artifacts and collections. Encourage you to share with your teachers the opportunities here for using the collections as part of curriculum and lesson plans that the library has provided and used as inspiration. We have a reading room for cultural events. We have music where the library, if you go to the website, there's a song of the day. You can have Israeli music fed to you each day with song. To give you a feel for what the library is going to look like and where you're going to be able to come visit. This is what's under construction. Again, this is probably a photograph from, I want to say November or December, and there's been much greater progress. The library is going to be a place for Jews and non-Jews of many different backgrounds to come together, to visit, to learn. This is the heart of the library, our layers of books. This has been designed by the famous architects Herzog de Meuron. They designed the Tate Modern and other major institutions around the world. This connotes sort of a well of knowledge, and you see the books spiraling down. There are layers and layers in this well of knowledge. We have, of course, our special collections reading room. We'll have music halls and places to congregate and hear lectures. We'll have exhibitions that will be available to the community, inspired by our collections. We'll have groups that will come and learn, adults, children, of course, will be a new education wing. All of this will be in Jerusalem, right next to, as you can see here in the hills, right next to the Knesset and the Israel Museum. And I want you to know that this is your library. This is our library. This is a place for all of us to enjoy, to come together and to use. And I feel privileged to be sharing it with all of you. With that, I'm going to turn to my colleague Yoel, who is here to bring you a real window into the library and its essence. Dr. Yoel Finkelman is curator of the Chaim and Hannah Solomon Judaica collection at the National Library of Israel, formerly a lecturer at Bar Ilan and a teacher of Torah in Jerusalem. His book, Strictly Kosher Reading, Popular Literature and the Condition of Contemporary Orthodoxy, appeared in 2011. And with that, I give you the esteemed Dr. Yoel Finkelman. Yoel, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Adina, and thank you, Rabbi Dratch and the Rabbinical Council of America and everybody in the back office of both of these institutions who made this possible. The goal of tonight's talk in the next 30 or 35 minutes or so is to talk a little bit about the history of the page layout of the Talmud, and maybe if I have some time toward the end to talk a little bit about the page layout of other rabbinic texts. Um, and especially in a lecture organized by the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, um, I hardly need to talk about the way in which page layout is central to the study of Talmud, to the study of Gemara. Those of us who have begun studying Talmud when we were children almost take it for granted, but it's actually a really bizarre way to lay out a page. And as time has gone by, I've become more and more convinced that you can't really separate out the function from the form, the medium from the message, and that there is a reason why Talmud in particular and rabbinic literature in general are kind of laid out in the unique ways that they are. And now we're going to try to convince. There we go. Now, I'm going to primarily bring examples from the National Library of Israel's collection. And I want to begin, especially in a rabbinic context, looking at something that might make people a little bit surprised, which is what looks like a Daf Gemara, what looks like a page of the Talmud, only it's in Latin. And this is, in fact, not a page of the Talmud at all. It is the Latin Bible with the Glossa Ordinaria and the commentary of Nicholas of Lyra, two very important medieval Catholic commentaries on the Bible. The Glossa Ordinaria, which is a kind of, if you will, art scroll collection of ancient, a gathering of ancient commentaries on the Bible that had a certain kind of canonical status as Catholic teaching, and Nicholas of Lyra, an important medieval commentary on the Bible, who incidentally was familiar with quite a bit of Rashi, and was in literary conversation with him, to say the very least. And the point I want to make with this 1498 printing, in addition to the fact that it happens to be in the National Library of Israel's collection, is to point out that the notion of having a central text in the center and multiple glosses or commentaries surrounding it on the page is not something that Jews invented. And it is not, certainly was not in the Middle Ages, something that was unique to Jews or Judaism or unique to the Gemara. In fact, it wasn't all that common in the Middle Ages in the Gemara. And I don't know who borrowed from whom or how, but broadly speaking, it wasn't so much that Jews invented and used this for Talmud for some reason, as much as Talmud, early printings of the Talmud were constructed in the ways in which one printed gloss texts at the time. And if we go back to prior to the founding or the invention in the West of print with movable type, if we work within the manuscript tradition, we're going to discover, and this is essentially a kind of random example, right? This is an Italian manuscript of Rashi on the Torah, of the most important Jewish commentary, medieval Jewish commentary on the Bible. It is only the commentary of Rashi. It does not have the biblical verses themselves. And this is a 15th century Italian manuscript. We could have brought examples from virtually anywhere. And the reason why you have, which looks terribly inconvenient to have the commentary without the text he's commenting on, is because it's simply too expensive to waste valuable space and to waste valuable time copying a text if the person who commissions the text individually already owns a copy of the Bible, or alternatively, even knows it by heart. And so if somebody's going to commission this text, and this is an example of a text that was commissioned, because you can see the handwriting is pretty professional and the line layout is pretty professional. So if I already own a copy of the Bible, I'm not going to spend the extra money on the very, very expensive enterprise of copying Rashi's commentary. And I'm going to find the same thing in the Talmud. Here we have Rashi's commentary on the Talmud in a much less professional script from the 15th century as well. And it's just Rashi's Perush on the Gemara. It's only Rashi's commentary without the text of the Gemara itself, undoubtedly created by or for a person who already had copies, handwritten copies of the Gemara, of the Talmud itself. And there's simply the costs involved in creating an individual manuscript were so high that it was not feasible under most circumstances to put the text, the base text, and the commentary on the same page. It is possible to do such a thing. Here we have a much earlier 13th century manuscript of the Talmud Bava Batra, Tractate Bava Batra, with Rashi's commentary, and you see that it starts to echo at least um, a little bit the later page layouts with the central text in the middle and the commentary surrounding it. But you also see how much space is wasted in this attempt. You have the Talmud over here. Do you see my cursor? Whoops. The Talmud over here, and Rashi's commentary over here. It's very difficult to plan a page perfectly in manuscript, and there's a great deal of wasted space that's created by this attempt to do so. We can also see examples. This is a much, much higher end example of a text with a commentary. The 14th century Ashkenazi Bible, Pentateuch Chumash, with Rashi's commentary and Masoretic notes. Very, very beautiful, very professionally copied with gold leaf decorations on the initial words. And here there's an enormous amount of planning that goes into designing the page and getting as much in as possible, but it's very difficult. So again, it is possible to have a gloss text in manuscript. It's just difficult and very expensive. By the time we enter the era of print, things are beginning to change significantly, because in the era of print, you have a number of examples that you didn't have in the manuscript era. The first is that you are printing not for an individual. You're printing for what you perceive to be a larger market. And therefore, you can't afford to alienate people. If you were to print only the text and only the commentary, or only the commentary, then you're going to miss out on a potential part of the market. But if you offer both a text and a commentary, then you have a potential larger market. Secondly, printing makes things cheaper. Early on, it doesn't make things so cheap the way that we're used to today, in which you can easily log on to your favorite online bookstore or walk into your favorite Jewish bookstore and purchase with the disposable income that many middle class people have become accustomed to, purchase any book you want, but at least printing makes things cheaper. And so there's less economic incentive to save space. There's still an incentive to save space, but it's not quite as great. And the third advantage is that it's possible to plan the individual page and get a better return on your investment. You can plan it, you can know in advance exactly how the page is going to turn out, and it's worth investing all the time and energy in planning each individual page, because you're going to get potentially hundreds of copies out of each time you lay out the page. And the result is that in print, printers all over the place, including Christian Bibles and canon laws we saw in the first slide, are experimenting with various ways of laying out text and commentary together. Here we're looking at the 1477 Italian printing. This is a printed edition. This is not a manuscript anymore. Tehillim, Psalms, with the commentary of Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, the medieval French commentator. This is a very, very interesting book. It's what's called an incunable, that is to say, a book that was printed using movable type in Europe between the invention of the printing press, the European invention of the printing press, and the year 1500. In those years, books printed are referred to as incunables. This is one of the between 150 and 200 Hebrew incunables. And it's a particularly interesting book because it's the first time that the Book of Psalms is printed in Hebrew. It's the first time that printers experimented with printing with nikud, that is to say, with pronunciation marks. It was a failed attempt. After a couple of pages, the printers gave up because it made laying out the page extraordinarily difficult, because instead of having 22 letters, or really it's more than that because there are different forms to choose from, you actually have exponentially more complicated ways of laying out the page because you have a letter and nikud and the pronunciation marks along with each letter. And so they kind of gave up after a page and a half. But in any case, look at this text. Here we have the verse of the Psalms in larger square print, and the commentary, the verse by verse commentary of Radak, of Kimchi, interspersed between the verses. This is what's called an interlinear gloss, and it's one way of kind of laying out a page in commentary. What's particularly interesting to me about this is what this says about the central text and the commentary. I'm going to say something a little bit surprising, but it's not if you think about it for a second. The central text in this book is the commentary of Kimchi, not Psalms. The way this is laid out makes it a terrible way to read Psalms. Any individual chapter of Psalms of Tehillim is going to be laid out over many pages. If you wanted to study the psukim, the verses themselves, or you wanted to recite Tehillim Psalms as part of a liturgy, as a prayer, this is a terrible volume to do that in because you're just going to be turning pages. But if you're interested in Radak's commentary, then this is a great way to lay it out because his commentary is verse by verse. What you need is the biblical verse for reference in order to understand the commentary. Now, we're going to get back to this when we talk more directly about the Talmud's printed page, and the way in which commentaries are not secondary in traditional Jewish learning. In the Beit Midrash, commentaries are not secondary to the original text. They are part and parcel of the study, and that the commentary itself becomes a primary source. We'll get to that in a minute, but in the meantime, I want to take a look at some of the early printings of the Gemara. This is a 1482 Spanish incunabula of the Talmud, Mesechet Kiddushin. And you will see that it is laid out with the Talmud over here and the commentary of Rashi surrounding it, and it's missing the commentary of the Tosafists, the Tosfot, that we are familiar with from virtually every printing of the Talmud from the 1520s and on. And there are two reasons for that. The first is that the Talmud page didn't get fixed. There wasn't a fixed Talmud page yet. These are the first people printing it. They didn't know what the rules were. And they were only going to discover later on that there were fixed rules, if you will, right? The rules hadn't been invented yet. The second is that this is a Spanish printing. And Rashi, even though Rashi is Ashkenazi, is from Northern Europe, his influence really spreads like wildfire over the rabbinic world, over the world of rabbinic learning, both his commentary on the Bible and his commentary on the Talmud. But the commentary of the Tosafists, the Baalei Tosfot, those commentaries were much more common and popular in Ashkenazi, in Northern European centers. And so Tosfot were not as central to the curriculum in Spain as they were in the curriculum in Ashkenaz. Roughly the same time, this is a slightly later version. This is a 1510 Sansino Talmud, the Sansino family, which is active primarily in Spain, in Italy, is printing not a full edition of the Talmud, but printing one volume at a time, one tractate at a time, focusing on the tractates that were studied in the yeshivot and therefore were more likely to sell well. And the Sansino family, here we have a Pizarro 1510 edition, starts to look very much like the page of Talmud that we're used to. But we're going to see that there are some important additions and changes that come about 10 years later. So here we have the Talmud in the center in square print, Rashi's commentary on the inside toward the margin in smaller print, and the commentary of the Tosfot on the outside margin, also in semi-cursive script. When we get to 1520, we get to one of my favorite characters in Jewish history, and that's Daniel Bomberg. Daniel Bomberg is a Christian. He moves to Venice and opens a printing shop in Venice in 1518 or 1519. He is a Christian, he's not Jewish, but he is a humanist. He's interested in Judaism. He's on good terms with learned members of the Jewish community in Venice, and also with members of the Jewish community who have converted to Catholicism. At the time, Jews are prohibited from owning printing presses in Venice. And he realizes Venice, which is a cultural center, which is a center of print in general, which is a shipping center throughout Europe, and not only throughout Europe, but also to the south and to the east. And he realizes that there's a business opportunity in printing Hebrew texts. He is also a master of marketing and also a master of the things that the new technology of print enable that were impossible. And he introduces two changes that are related to one another and change the face of Talmud study and Talmud printing for the rest of history. The first is that he prints the entire Talmud, the entire Gemara, the whole thing, not isolated Masechtot, not isolated tractates, but the whole thing. The second is he numbers the pages, or really numbers the folios, and you can see over here, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. We'll get to these arrows in a second. But you can see over here the daf bet in the upper left-hand corner of the page. This is Tractate Psachim, or La'arba'a Asar Bodkin et HaChametz Le'or HaNer. You can read in the middle passage. And he introduces folio numbers, which anybody who's ever studied Talmud knows is central, but he invented it. It didn't exist before 1520. And he realizes that the folio numbers are critical because they can serve as a reference guide. They can serve as a kind of index. In other words, print enables things that were absolutely impossible in the age of manuscript. Proper tables of contents, proper indexing, routine and uniform pagination, or ways of structuring and laying out a single text, because you're making multiple copies of the same thing. And there's no individual in this process who have enough say to say, this is the way I like it. And if you're commissioning a manuscript or copying a manuscript for yourself, you have all kinds of individual idiosyncrasies, how much time you have, how much money you have, how good your eyesight is, what other texts you have in your collection. And so Bomberg is picking up on this technology, the way in which indexing is changing, and don't look a slight on the history of indexing, ways of organizing information. I can't recommend enough Anne Blair's fantastic book, Too Much to Know, about the history of indexing in the Renaissance. And he introduces these fixed page numbers. And then as he's printing other works, which refer back to the Talmud, he references the page numbers or the folio numbers of his own edition, which means that if you have a copy of one of the commentaries, it's really nice to have a copy of his full set of the Talmud. It's a kind of planned obsolescence of earlier printed editions. Now, let's think about, beside the indexing of the page numbers, let's think a little bit about the experience of study. Because one of the things that I want to say in the course of this talk is the idea that page layout reflects what people do with books. And if, again, in a lecture sponsored by the Rabbinical Council of America, I don't have to, go into what the Talmud is, but we know that it is layered and builds on questions and ambiguities and attempts to solve problems. The earliest layer is the Mishnah, the most ancient layer of the Talmud. It itself contains generally multiple opinions. The Talmud itself is a commentary on the Mishnah, the earlier layer. It itself raises all kinds of questions. And the Babylonian Talmud in particular is very, very interested in exploring all sides of a particular question. This opinion, that opinion, can we challenge this opinion? Can we defend that opinion? And so we're dealing with ambiguities, questions, and challenges. And what happens on the Talmudic page? What happens is Rashi, the commentary over here, will look at the text of the Mishnah and the Talmud, ask questions about it, provide answers. Sometimes he doesn't tell you what the question is. He just fills in background information. He smooths out the rough edges in the text. In other words, he's a commentary on the already layered text. And then we have the commentary of the Tosophists. Now, typically also trying to work out a different set of problems with the Talmudic texts, unlike Rashi, who tends to focus on the immediate, local, simple meaning of the text in question. The Tosophists are interested in bringing together, creating a harmonious interpretation of the Talmud as a whole. And so they're always bringing in other places in the Talmud, apparent contradictions between this passage and other passages, coming up with creative ways of solving them. In some ways, you could say that Tosfot did to the Gemara what the Gemara did to the Mishnah. But also notice that a typical passage of Tosfot begins with the statement Perusha Kuntras, roughly translated as "this is how Rashi reads the Talmud." The Kasher, and I've got a problem with it, or we have a problem with it. The Tosfot were several people, and so what you get on the page is a conversation about what things mean, how they mean, and a conversation that's occurring at multiple levels in dialogue with the other pieces of the page. More than that, I would say that the goal of traditional Beit Midrash study is not to get the right answer, but it's to understand the various voices. One does not say in the Beit Midrash, this is what the Gemara, this is what the Talmud means. One says there's a three-way machloket, there's a three-way dispute. Rashi reads it this way, Tosfot read it that way, Rambam or Maimonides, Nachmanides, any of the other commentaries read it another way. Your goal is not to know the right interpretation. Your goal is to understand the alternative possible interpretations. And therefore, it's necessary not to do what ends up happening. Hold on one second. I'm going to skip a little bit. What ends up happening, let's say, in a modern work of scholarship. Here, I've taken the introduction to the Code of Maimonides by the late Rabbi Professor Isidore Tversky, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, just as an example in which, notice this page layout. I have a text and I have footnotes at the bottom. Professor Tversky, Rabbi Tversky, is doing the work for you. He's telling you what he thinks the right meaning is, the right organization, the right analysis of Maimonides. He puts the footnotes here in order to enable you to go back and check, in order to create transparency. But this text is a text you're going to read, scan one page at a time, because he's doing the legwork for you. And the footnotes are just there to help you go back and retrace his steps and double check. But if we go back to our Talmudic page, that's not what this is about. The goal of the Beit Midrash is to dive in, it looks like chaos, and to make sense out of it on your own. For a traditional lamdan, for a real student in the Beit Midrash, having somebody spoon feed it to you is not good enough. You have to dive in and figure it out yourself. Now, the next stage is going to be the Justinian Talmud 1550 in Venice. And the first time we get another important addition to the Talmudic page, which is Mesoret HaShas or Mesoret HaTalmud in this edition, the Torah Or, which cross-reference, and the Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, that cross-reference the Talmud to three different sets of sources. Cross-references the Talmud to itself, This passage appears not only here in Masechet Sotah, but also in another place. It references the biblical verses that are quoted in the Talmud. This is where this verse came from. And it references the Talmud to works of Jewish law, like Maimonides' code, the Torah, or the Shulchan Aruch, various codes of Jewish law. And so then you get this kind of incestuous relationship. Remember that this is absolutely impossible without Bomberg's page numbers. Because without Bomberg's page numbers, you have no effective way of referencing the Talmud. It's really not helpful to say this passage appears somewhere in the 3rd chapter of Psachim. That's just too hard to find. More than that, we're not going to have time to get into the details here, but Bomberg is also the first Jew to introduce chapter and verse to a Bible. And that enables the possibility of cross-referencing the verse, because the verse now has a place. You can tell you it's in Psalms chapter 26, it's in Genesis chapter 11. And if you don't have chapter numbers, it's really hard to cross-reference things. So Bomberg's introduction of these indexing tools, not only page numbers, but also chapter and verse in the Bible, creates in the next generation among people who studied and worked in Bomberg's printing house, the possibility of doing this kind of cross-referencing. This cross-referencing creates a kind of incestuous relationship, if you will, in which every layer of commentary upon commentary of interpretation of Jewish law is sending you back to the multiple voices that appear on multiple pages. Just as an aside, for the fun of it, here's one of the counter examples. After Bomberg and after Justinian, everybody prints the Talmud with the same page numbers that Bomberg did. Minor differences here and there, especially in Masechet Brachot, but basically everybody prints the Talmud exactly as Bomberg did. Here's one example. It's the counterexample. It's the exception that proves the rule. The Krakow 1616 edition. There were various attempts by Maharal, among others, to try to return to a simple reading of the Gemara. Didn't really take off. These were not commercial successes. And maybe the thing that kind of exemplifies the way in which the learning of the Beit Midrash, dive in yourself, it's chaotic, make sense out of it, there's layers upon layers of conversation and commentary, is the same period, 1551, including the same printer, Justinian. And then there's another one, there's a long story here, eventually how this leads to the burning of the Talmud in 1553. Huge dispute between these two printers related to printing a commentary in their edition of Maimonides. Now, we don't have time to get into the details of this story, but it's a great story, albeit a tragic one. But here, look what happens in the 1551 edition of Maimonides' code. Maimonides is famous, Rambam is famous as an introduction to the code of Jewish law of saying, I'm going to give you just the bottom line. Now, whatever he meant by the odd statement in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah, to his code of Jewish law, that he wants to get past the Talmud, whatever he means by that, and it's above my pay grade to determine what he meant by that. Suffice it to say, he certainly wanted the Mishneh Torah, his code of Jewish law, to stand alone and to be simply a summary of the bottom line of Jewish law, to make it unnecessary to dive into the nitty-gritties of the Talmud. But look what happens. The printers drag Rambam Maimonides back to the Beit Midrash. They don't let him get away with what he wants. He wins. I don't know if he wins the war and loses the battle, or wins the battle and loses the war, but Rambam succeeds in his book becoming canonical, but fails miserably in his attempt to make it the bottom line, the authoritative source of Jewish law. Because by the time you hit the 1550s, Rambam, the Maimonides code, is laid out kind of like a Talmudic page, in which you have cross references and you have commentaries, and where's he getting it from in the Talmud, and how's he interpreting the Talmud, and how's he interacting with Rashi's commentary and the previous commentaries, and is he right or maybe he's wrong? And then you get text in the center and commentary and arguing and bickering and fighting and machloket l'shem shamayim. Not to mention, especially if you're looking at the Ra'avad, some choice insults here and there, but dispute. And Rambam's supposedly simple code is dragged into the intellectual atmosphere of the Beit Midrash with its incessant commentary, counter commentary, argument, dispute, and conversation. Now, I just want to point out, going back to the Talmud page, if we think about the Talmud page, a printed edition of the Justinian Talmud in 1550, which includes the text of the Talmud, Rashi, Tosfot, various commentaries in the back, and cross-references to numbers of other books. Well, the green arrows here are representing texts that are in the Talmud itself, places where the texts are written, the Babylonian Talmud, the Mishnah, Rashi and the Tosafists, Italian text, where it's printed. And the red represents texts that are cross-referenced, like the Shulchan Aruch, like Rambam's Mishneh Torah from Egypt, like Ramah's gloss on the Shulchan Aruch written in Poland. What you have is a transnational conversation in one book. It's all there. The entire known Jewish world is present in a copy of the Talmud, and Jewish history throughout 1600 years or 1400 years is present in that one volume, going all the way back to the Mishnah and all the way cross-referencing to the 16th century Ramah glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, all in layers and layers and layers upon layers of commentary, super commentary, argument, dispute that is kept alive in the style of the Beit Midrash with the incessant arguing and insistence that the student work it out, generally himself, and in the last short period of time herself as well. Dive in and figure it out on your own, and you are part of the long timeline of Jewish intellectual Torah history, and also part of this transnational conversation. 2 points in the 1 minute that I have left. The first is this page layout disappears over the course of the 16th century in Latin texts. The accomplishment of the Talmudic page layout is not its invention, but it's its staying power. It's a pet peeve of mine when rabbis and Jewish intellectuals make binary distinctions. Judaism says this, Christianity says that, and I'm not going to try to avoid doing it in the other direction, but I suspect that this has something to do with the Reformation, 16th century Reformation, and a return to the Bible itself, unglossed and and without commentary, as well as the counter-Reformation and the attempt to counter that on the part of the Catholic Church, as well as the simple lowering of prices of books through the printing press and the ability of people to get more and more texts. And I think there's something about the Beit Midrash that is unique. There's something about rabbinic learning that is unique, that makes it attractive to this kind of page layout, even insists on it. And that uniqueness of the Beit Midrash is part of this expectation from the student to dive in, make sense on your own of the layers upon layers of commentary, the layers upon layers of dispute, and the layers upon layers of possible meanings and ambiguities in any given text. Finally, in the 30 seconds that I don't have left, look at a history of commentaries on the Bible. Bomberg's 1517 First Rabbinic Bible, Bomberg's 1525 Second Rabbinic Bible. Notice very similar layouts, central text in the center, commentary around the outside. Later 1540s, another Rabbinic Bible, Berlin 1705, first printing of the Rashbam, a very important commentary. Later 1897, Mikraot Gedolot, multiple commentaries on the page, laid out somewhat differently than the Talmud, different commentaries than what you had in the earlier period. This is a 20th century Mosad Rav Kook Torat Chaim. The Chumash Tanakh never gets a fixed page layout. Gemara does, the Talmud does. And I think that there is a seemingly technical reason for that, which is actually super important. There's a non-technical reason, which there's a lot of things you can do with a Chumash, with the Bible. You can read it liturgically, you can recite it, you can study it with commentary, you can study it without commentary. You could prepare for Kriyat Torah, for the reading in the synagogue. There's really only one thing you can do with the Talmud, and that's study it with commentaries. There aren't that many other options. I mean, you can fall asleep. That's the other option. And therefore, the Bible lends itself to multiple layouts and multiple versions. But the other more prosaic reason why there are so many multiple different layouts of the Talmud is because once Bomberg introduces chapter and verse, every layout is cross-referenceable to every other layout. And it doesn't matter. I can take this edition and find Exodus chapter 29, or I can take that edition and find Exodus chapter 29, verse 3. But I can't do that in Gemara. There's no natural way of breaking it up. And so the artificial way that Bomberg invented became sacrosanct over the course of the years because there's no other way to cross-reference it. And the simple act of indexing is so powerful that we simply cannot do without it. And it's this seemingly prosaic need for an index that creates the possibility of things like Daf Yomi, that creates the possibility of the kind of study and the kind of use of multiple volumes and commentaries that have become common. Not going to get into the Art Scroll Talmud as much as I'd like to, but at this point I've gone a little over time, but we do have a little bit of time for questions, so I'd be happy if there are questions in the chat if people are willing to share them, or you can just open up your microphone. Does that work?
Dr. Finkelman, thank you so very much. And let's try microphones first. It might be easier. If it becomes too burdensome, we will go to the chat. Two quick questions. One is, could you comment on Rabbi Steinsaltz's change of the Tzurat Hadaf? And secondly, if you were giving this lecture to us any number of decades in the future, now that printing has changed and it's digital, and computers have changed the written word, what would you be saying differently?
Those are, I think, two related questions. Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz, who attempted to create in the 1970s, the first, not the first, but a translation into modern Hebrew and simple commentary on the Talmud, was very, very controversial. And among the reasons why he was controversial was because some of the more right-wing or conservative elements within the Orthodox community thought that his attempt to violate the sacrosanct nature of the page numbers and page layout was chutzpah. I don't know how much of that was genuine. It certainly is true that there is some sacrosanct feel to the page layout and the pages over the course of years, and how much of that was a ideological dispute, a kind of a hook to hang ideological disputes with him that ran deeper. The very attempt to kind of bring the Talmud out of the traditional Orthodox milieu and bring it to a kind of secular Israeli audience. I don't know any of the answers to those questions, but it's certainly an important piece of the puzzle. And it's interesting if we would talk about Art Scroll, which kind of skipped the last slide, but it's and the modern commentaries that have come out, imitations of Steinsaltz. I venture to say that Art Scroll might be the most important commentary on the Talmud since Rashi. It's an absolute masterpiece, but they kept the traditional pages along with their easy to read, accessible commentary made for these massive 70-something volume works, which are also good because it makes them expensive and the publishers make a lot of money. There's an economic side to all of this, which is super important. I mean, publishers are in this to make money. What's going to be 20 or 30 years from now? What did Yogi Berra say? The hardest thing of all to predict is the future. I don't know. the page layout of the Talmud is, 500 years is an awfully long time in the history of printing. And people, the digital resources, I don't think have made the revolution yet. Sefaria, the digital version of the Talmud with Rabbi Steinsaltz's or his institute's later kind of translation, as a step in that direction. But Daf Yomi is also a powerful force. In short, I don't know, but the digital revolution is, just like in the 1470s, they didn't know how much of a big deal print was. I don't think that we know how big of a deal the digital revolution is going to be for traditional text study. But my tendency is a little conservative. I don't know if Daf and Amud, if page numbers are going anywhere, but I wouldn't assume that they're disappearing so quickly.
Thank you. But somebody has a question, please unmute yourself and present.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the choice by Yoshua Shlomo Ish Sansino to put the Tosfot on the page as being one of the more important decisions in Jewish learning and Jewish history?
Yeah, I can say very little about that. Basically, as it became perfectly clear, I'm a big Bomberg fan, and I want to give him more credit for Tosfot even than Sansino. That is to say, what Sansino, the Sansino family, and their early editions of Talmudic tractates included Tosfot, and part of that had to do with the popularity of Tosfot among the market in Italy and in Northern Europe, and also that the text was flexible enough to get it to fit on a page because there were multiple versions. You could kind of tweak it or shorten it or make it longer to fit on a page as you saw fit. And then Bomberg, because he was in competition with the Sansino family, stuck in the Tosafists' commentary. Both, he wasn't in a position to evaluate the intellectual value of Tosfot commentary on the Talmud, but as a marketing decision, he was going up against his biggest competitor. And once Bomberg did it, and that became the format of Talmud, then Tosfot stuck. What would have happened had it been a different commentary on the page? What if it had been the Rif or the Rush or Rabbeinu Hananel, or any of the other, earlier commentaries that are more intellectually conservative than Tosfot? The Tosfot are they're all over the place. They're really, really coming up with incredibly creative interpretations that don't always have the most solid grounding in what the words seem to say, and in their enthusiasm for solving contradictions between different passages, they have to introduce a lot of new material. What would have happened to Jewish intellectual history, to Jewish law, had it been a different text on the page? That's pretty hard to tell, but I think that was primarily a business decision that had enormous intellectual impact on Jewish tradition.
Other questions?
I have sort of a comment. It seemed to me that we speak about the digital revolution. Really, it's going back to Bomberg, because Bomberg was the first one who had hyperlinks. You click on the text of the Talmud, and there's Rashi. So he did it instead of with a hyperlink. He did it by having bolded text, or whoever put the bolded text in. Same thing with Tosfos. You're looking at your text, and suddenly you have the hyperlink to Tosfos, and even with the guys on the side, they tell you where you click on it, and there's the Rambam. So, to a certain extent, digital is really going back, it's not the world of the future. It shows what the world of the past did without having the internet.
I think that there is a lot to that. I mean, you could even go further. We talk about, what do we do with our phones? We scroll. Scroll was not a advanced technology anytime in the last 1800 years. We communicate with emojis, which are very much like, early script that symbolize pictures. We do ourselves, I'm going to say kind of what Joseph just said, maybe in a slightly different tone, by saying that we do ourselves a disservice if we think that everything about technology is new. And we do ourselves a disservice if we don't realize that things that we take for granted were once the cutting edge of technology. The printing press, indices, even paper. Paper is just this unbelievable technology that we wouldn't have government, money, bureaucracy, science without paper. And so we ought to realize that technology is not just what was just invented, it's also the things that changed the world a long time ago when they were just invented.
Very nice. If there are no other questions, I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Finkelman for this very wonderful presentation, very, very interesting. It introduced us to, for those of us who are learning Talmud on a regular basis, to what's been in front of us, in front of our eyes for days and for years, and helps appreciate more what it is that we are seeing and how it came about. I'd like to thank the National Library of Israel for making this particular presentation available to us, and all the wonderful work that they are doing. To remind you that this is the first of a 3-part series. We will convene again next week on Monday, April 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic will be Jewish manuscripts through the ages, and we will hear from Yitzchak Gila, head of the Manuscripts Department of the National Library of Israel, and from Hillel Gershuni of Hebrew University and the Friedberg Geniza Project. Please join us with the same link next week, and as well the week after on April the 26th. Adina, anything you want to say before we sign off?
I just want to thank everybody and say, spread the word about the National Library of Israel. Use it, go to the digitized resources, and engage, and follow up with me at Adina at NLI USA if you have any .org if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Thank you for joining us.